Howdy, everyone. Colin, real quick, were you the one who asked about Hawthorne effect in animals a while back?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I did a little bit of looking into that. There's actually a study that someone did uh, looking at the effect of cockroaches, how fast they run mazes when observed by other cockroaches, and found a Hawthorne effect in cockroaches running mazes faster when observed by other cockroaches. So, um, it was from the 60s. We don't do that type of research as much as anymore. But yeah, I'll send you a link. So Hawthorne effect stuff is, and for people who aren't familiar, Hawthorne effect is sort of change in behavior based on sort of the observation of behavior type of thing. Um, and we started to call it different names. It was some social facilitation and things along those lines. Or we know from intervention stuff, having you, let's say you bite your fingernails. And so if I just have you monitor how often you bite your fingernails, you monitoring biting your fingernails is probably going to see some reduction in sort of how often you bite your fingernails. So sort of this stuff happens all the time now. The extent to which so that goes into like non-human primates or sort of other things is kind of an interesting sort of question. But yeah, I guess there's evidence, at least in humans and cockroaches, so, at least some social facilitation going on there. But I don't know if that's a good study. I didn't read through all of, but it's was done by a really, really big name historically, a guy named Zients. We'll talk about him when we get into some emotion stuff. So, all right. But enough about Hawthorne effect and cockroaches. How's everybody doing? Good? Cool. Glad. Thanks everybody for making it in on Friday. I guess any questions about where we're at thus far, sort of moving into sort of this next unit. So we got quiz 3 under our belt. So we're going to go quiz 4. That'll be kind of the halfway point for us. But you're doing a lot of these, starting to get the hang of these quizzes again. As a cohort, your scores were the highest on this quiz on average than sort of I've ever had in any section. So congratulations on you. You're really going through and putting forth effort and things like that, which is good to see. I've had a lot of questions about, where, can I see my grade? Issue with seeing grade for this course is because, and the reason I don't sort of have a running total in wild courses is your final grade is going to be based on, I won't know your final grade until we get to the end. Because some of this is going to depend on your research, how many research hours that you've got, and whether or not you've gotten any extra credit. And so that's going to be a huge chunk. My concern with having some sort of running total on wild courses is that people are going to go through and they're going to say, "Oh, I'm doing fine, cool." But then if they don't get their research and then they get their final grade and it's much lower than they thought it was going to be, or people think I'm going to fail this and I need to withdraw or drop out or something like that, when you're actually not. You're going to be fine so long as you got your research and stuff like that. So if you're interested, want to know kind of where you stand and sort of what your targets need to be, go through and just shoot me an email. I'm happy to go through, figure that out. Helped a couple of people get squared away on that. But yeah, it's just the way scores are structured in your final final grade. I'm afraid it would be misleading to have that up. So you'll have each one of your quiz scores, right? Post those up. You can go through, see, make sure that squares with what your records show in the quiz scores stuff, and then just make sure that you're staying on top of your research, and then going through, making sure you're hitting appointments, not being late for stuff, and that's going to get you your research and then additional extra credit beyond that. Okay. Any questions? All right, cool. Well, what we'll do then is jump into this. This is probably one of my favorite units. This stuff is cool. We're going to teach you about learning and conditioning. Right? Dan's excited. I'm excited too. some really interesting stuff going on here. And when we get down to it, sort of this gets into some of this idea of sort of basic behaviorism, right? And if you remember radical behaviorists, like way back sort of in the 60s, 50s and 60s, this idea that my behavior is completely determined by my learning history. Human behavior is a complete is completely determined by stimulus response. This idea of free will and sort of like, oh, I'm doing what I want to do is all an illusion. Sort of all things that I do at any point in time are a function of my genes, my environment, and my learning history. Now, that was radical behaviorism. Radical behaviorism, there's not too many radical behaviorists out there anymore, but behaviorism as a tradition is irrefutable in terms of science. We do know that our learning history has a strong impact on sort of how we behave, the choices that we make. And so in this unit, we're going to go through some basic sort of principles of learning and how we sort of understand some of this stuff. So it's cool stuff. All right. So first thing we want to sort of cover is this idea of associative learning. If we're talking about associative learning, this is going to be any learning that occurs following the pairing of two or more different stimuli. Okay. So if I see behavior change after two or more different stimuli have been sort of presented together, what we would talk about, we would identify this as a form of associative learning. Okay. Two different types of associative learning. Okay. First is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, we're talking about reflexive responses that we acquire or organisms will acquire through some association with some intrinsically biologically significant stimulus. Okay. Can someone give me an example of classical conditioning? Or something that would identify or that would qualify as an example of classic conditioning?
Just like Pavlov's dog is like the most main example.
Perfect, Vance. Yeah, exactly. Pavlov's dog. And Vance, help me out. Tell me a little bit what was going on with Pavlov's dog. What were they trained to do?
So he was teaching his dogs to realize that it's time to be fed when he rings a bell.
Mm-hmm.
And so he would show them the bell stimulus, and then the food would come after. And
Mm-hmm.
then eventually he would start ringing the bell, and the dogs would start salivating without even any food near.
Yep. Beautiful. Okay. And so what we see here is a reflexive response, salivation, right? And what can you do right now? Quick, salivate real fast. Yeah, you can't do that, right? Because that's something like, and for any of you who has to go into the union down into the commons and anybody had to do a COVID spit test? Yeah, it's weird, right? Because I have to sit there and spit 5 gallons into a tube, but my body only produces it so fast, right? So like I can't will saliva into my mouth. It's a reflexive response. But what we saw in Pavlov's experiments is we paired some sort of stimulus with something that's biologically relevant. This is food, right? If I'm presented with food, my mouth is going to start watering, right? But if we pair food with this stimulus, what's going to happen is pretty soon we start to draw a connection. And so when we're talking about classical conditioning, the outcome is always going to be something that's biological, that's kind of reflexive, right? Something that we don't have voluntary control over, like salivation. Okay. Operant conditioning, on the other hand, this is learning where we see the probability or the likelihood of some volitional response increased or decreased based on consequences. So someone tell me, what's a volitional response? What are we talking about here? Any ideas? If we're talking about a volitional response, this just means something that I do on purpose. Okay. Who do I got sort of my sights here? Jaden, you raise your right hand? Okay. Jaden, why did you do that?
Because he told me to.
Because I told you to, right? And if I said, Jaden, okay, now you get an A on the next exam because you raise your hand, right? How many of your hand raises are you going to get from everybody else, right? What we start to see is something that you've done intentionally, right? Raising your hand is not a reflexive or sort of automatic response. It's something that you did on purpose, right? And so if we're working with stuff that people are doing on purpose, we're generally, and based on sort of rewards, consequences, we're talking about an operant conditioning paradigm, okay? So the rules play a little bit different, whether we're talking about classical conditioning, operant conditioning. Today we're going to talk about the classical conditioning paradigm. But just remember, when you're trying to tease these things apart, if the outcome is something that's automatic, sort of biological, reflexive, we're talking about a classical conditioning paradigm. If it's something volitional that I chose to do, that I sort of physically did on purpose, that's going to be an operant conditioning situation. Okay. So all of this early learning research, setting the stage for behaviorism. This is, as we started to figure this stuff out, this is what really, when people started figuring out the rules, those early behaviorists said, we have unlocked the secrets. We have sort of an account of why organisms behave the way they do as a result of this associative learning, this stimulus response type of thing. Okay. So early experiments. Vance pointed us in the right direction here. Ivan Pavlov. Okay. Now Ivan Pavlov, everybody's heard Pavlov, right? Pavlov is part of sort of our sort of the world sort of understanding of, like, it's a sort of cultural thing. Okay. Let's see. I need to get a. There we go. Okay. Pavlov was a physiologist, and what Pavlov was originally doing was looking at sort of trying to research the role of saliva in digestion. Okay. What Pavlov was wanting to do is sort of look at how sort of saliva helps animals or sort of organisms go through and process food and things like that. And so what Pavlov did is he was using dogs, because dogs produce a lot of saliva. So it's a convenience type of thing. Okay. And so with the research, what Pavlov actually did is kind of gross, but taking the salivary glands from the inside of the dog's mouth and removing them and surgically attaching them to the outside of the dog. Yeah, Annie, is gross, right? So that to be able to collect that saliva more easily. And this was sort of late 19th century, so you didn't have to worry about ethics or things along those lines. But what they started to do is bring these dogs like some sort of food or meat powder or something like that they could smell and would spark salivation. And sort of depending on sort of the legend you hear is that what they started to find is that when before too long, the dog started salivating to anytime someone entered the room, because experimenters would come in delivering the meat powder. Dogs would salivate. Experimenter come in, deliver the meat powder. Dogs would salivate. And then before too long, anytime experimenter would come in the room, dog would start to salivate. Pavlov called these psychic secretions, because there was no reason those dogs should be having a biologically determined response in the absence of this food. And so at that point, shifted the whole situation away from, so we're not doing research on digestion and saliva anymore. What we're going to do now is we're going to focus our efforts on trying to understand these psychic secretions. Why are these dogs salivating when there's no physiological reason for them to be salivating? At least is how we understand things right now. Okay. So this served as the basis for our understanding of classical conditioning. Okay, and in classical conditioning, what we have are a set of stimulus response elements that produce some automatic, biologically sort of prepared behavior. Okay, so what we need to do before we even get started, want to sort of identify our unconditioned stimulus and our unconditioned response. When you hear unconditioned, it just means unlearned. Unconditioned means it was already there. I didn't have to acquire it. It's just something that exists already. Okay. So our unconditioned stimulus is some stimulus that triggers an automatic reflexive response. Okay. Now, if we were all in person, what I would do right now is scream like a banshee at you, and many of you would jump. Okay. And I would say, hey, what happened? You screamed like a crazy person, and then I startled, right? Again, did you say, Vance, I screamed and you just jumped. Did you mean to jump? Did you process that? Did you say, hey, someone yelled something and I just jumped?
No, not at all.
No, right? What you would do is your body automatically, reflexively does that, right? Just like Annie can't produce saliva on command, you can't have a true startle reaction on command. This is a biological thing, right? So that would be the unconditioned response. The unconditioned stimulus is the stimulus that triggers that response. Okay. So Vance, if I scream and you jump, what's the unconditioned stimulus?
Me jumping.
Okay, that's the unconditioned response. That's what you did. What was the stimulus that caused?
To be you screaming.
Yeah, the loud, startling noise, the unexpected noise. Okay, so when we start out with these classical conditioning paradigms, always, always, always important to recognize my unconditioned stimulus. Stimulus is something that happens. Response is something that I do. Okay, so in the case of Pavlov, unconditioned stimulus is going to be the food. Okay. Unconditioned response is the salivation, right? Did we need to teach these dogs how to salivate? Nope, they came prepared with that, right? They were born with that. This is an automatic thing that happens no matter what, right? So we've got food, a biologically relevant stimulus. We've got salivation, a biologically relevant response. These two things are paired even before we start screwing around with anything, okay? So people who sort of get the handle on unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response. Okay. So what we do then to this thing that's already going on, has been going on throughout this organism's entire life, is we add a neutral stimulus. Okay. A neutral stimulus is a novel thing that elicits no natural response. Okay. In the wild, this thing, what I'm doing is I'm introducing some sort of thing, some signal, some type of stimulus that has no intrinsic meaning. There's nothing, this thing means nothing, okay, to most people, right? So in Pavlov's situation, so depending on whether it's a bell or a buzzer, the details don't matter, right? What they did is they started to introduce this bell. And if I ring a bell for a dog, does that bell biologically mean anything for that dog? Nope. Right? It might orient towards it, like, okay, here's a new thing, right? But the bell itself contains no information. There's nothing going on here, so it's neutral, okay? So at the stage, so when we start out, what we have is an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response that are paired together. This is already there, already existing. The unconditioned stimulus triggers a biologically sort of automatic reflexive reaction. And then we have a neutral stimulus. This is just something that happens sort of that doesn't have any intrinsic meaning or cause any response. Okay? But what we do is, so if I have food, present the food, the dog salivates, right? If I have the bell, I ring the bell, the dog doesn't do anything, right? This is stage one. But as I transition to stage two, what I start to do is I start to present my unconditioned stimulus and my neutral stimulus at the same time. I'm presenting these things simultaneously, okay? Or I'm presenting the neutral stimulus very, very close in time, immediately before the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus. The pairing on this is very important. If I ring the bell after I present the food, this isn't going to work. Okay, but if I present them simultaneously, the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus presented at the same time, I do this over and over and over and over and over again. Brooke, eventually what happens? If I pair these things over and over and over and over again.
Oh, sorry. then they're going to associate the bell with getting food.
Yeah, they're going to associate the bell with the food eventually. And sort of depending on what we're trying to pair together, it sort of depends on how long this takes. But eventually, at some point, I'm going to go through and I can ring that bell. And when I ring that bell, Brooke, what's the dog going to do?
Salivate.
Salivate. Okay. The moment that this happens, the moment that I present that neutral stimulus, and that neutral stimulus elicits some response in the absence of the unconditioned stimulus. I ring the bell, which was the neutral stimulus, in the absence of food, which is the unconditioned stimulus. The moment that that bell elicits a biological response in that organism, we've achieved classical conditioning. At that point, the neutral stimulus is no longer a neutral stimulus, it's become a conditioned stimulus. The unconditioned response, the salivation, is no longer an unconditioned response when it happens when I don't present it with something that should cause it. That unconditioned response becomes a conditioned response when occurring in the presence of the conditioned stimulus, when the neutral or when the unconditioned stimulus isn't around. Okay, so in this situation, there's only three things that you really need to keep in mind, right? We've got our unconditioned stimulus. This is the food. Food causes salivation. Food causes salivation all the time. We don't ever screw around with that, right? But we've got a neutral stimulus. That neutral stimulus, the bell, starts out as being meaningless. It conveys no information. It's not biologically relevant to me until I pair it with the food over and over and over and over again. And the moment that that bell that was neutral now elicits a salivary response, that's no longer a neutral stimulus. It's transitioned to a conditioned stimulus. When you see conditioned, just think about learned. Unconditioned means unlearned. Conditioned just means learned. Okay? And so the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus. And the salivation, when that salivation is occurring when there's not food around, there's no biological reason for me to salivate if there's not food around, right? But the moment that that conditioned stimulus elicits that reflexive biological reaction, that response has gone from an unconditioned response to a conditioned response. Okay. So in this scenario, the bell was a neutral. The bell started out as the neutral stimulus. It transitions to a conditioned stimulus the moment it starts eliciting salivation. Salivation was the unconditioned response when it was occurring when you presented food. But as soon as it's happening in the absence of food in response to the bell, that's now a conditioned response. So let's go through a couple of additional, I guess, first questions on this. Classical conditioning, once you've kind of got it figured out, things start to fall into place, but it can be tricky to sort of make sure that you got everything squared away. Do people, questions about sort of this setup here? Okay. Oh, yeah.
Dr. Pop, I think someone has a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Carlos, so does that mean phantom phone vibrations is a form of... Carlos, do you have audio? Can you... I'm not sure what phantom phone vibrations are. I'm a geezer, I guess. Nothing.
I think it's like when you feel your phone vibrating in your pocket, even though it's not.
Okay.
Even if you feel your phone vibrating, it's not even there.
Okay. Carlos, there might be some stuff that sort of plays into that. That's probably going to get a little bit more complicated than sort of the classic setup that we've got here. Let's go through a couple of examples. Okay. So, for example, let's say, and this is just based on some of the research that I've sort of done previously. Let's say, who wants to? Jacob, I haven't picked on you yet. Let's say, Jacob, you get in a nasty car accident, and following that car accident, anytime you get and sit inside of a car, you start to have an intense sort of reaction, right? Shaking, sweating, things. Right now, Jabe, can you shake and sweat sort of have GI distress if I asked you to?
I don't think so.
Probably not, right? So it's an automatic response. So we're talking about a classical conditioning situation, okay? So again, the scenario is Jacob was in a really nasty car accident, right? And now is having automatic reactions anytime he gets in the car, okay? So in this situation, before the accident, or excuse me, during the accident, what is the unconditioned stimulus? Anybody have an idea? So if we think about this accident, so this would be a sort of a one episode sort of learning situation. What would be the unconditioned stimulus in the accident?
Would it be the accident?
Yeah, and Jacob, so how about this? Let's start with what's the unconditioned response? So how do you respond to that accident?
Well, I mean, probably gonna like flinch around because you don't want to hurt your. I don't know.
Yeah, no, okay, no, you're on the right track. Okay, so unconditioned response here is going to be sort of like my physiological reactions, fear, anxiety, and the unconditioned stimulus in this case is going to be the accident, the threat, right? Sort of the very real, like I'm in a car accident, things are threatening me. So threat is the unconditioned stimulus. The reaction that happens when we're under threat is increased physiological activity, anxiety, fear, things along those lines. Okay. But in this car accident, before this accident, what's the neutral stimulus? If now, sort of down the road, I'm reacting to, if I get in a car, I start to sweat, shake, sort of feel intense fear.
Driving would be your neutral stimulus.
Driving, but yeah, exactly, Colin. But even for people with severe accident phobias, it's not even driving. It's just sitting in the car, right? So in this case, what we would say is the car is a neutral stimulus. Does anybody sweat, shake when they see a car just sort of absent some sort of pairing? No. Car is just what it is. It's just hanging out there, right? But in this situation, what we've done is we've taken the car, which is the neutral stimulus, and we've paired it with accident, injury, threat, danger, which is the unconditioned stimulus, which then that unconditioned stimulus results in an unconditioned response, okay? But what happens after that one pairing is now, anytime Jacob goes through and sits in a car, he's having physiological reactions. He's having fear, threat, shaking, and things like that. And so after that accident, what has the car become?
The conditioned stimulus.
The conditioned stimulus, exactly. And Jacob, one more time, man, and then I'll leave you alone. What's your conditioned response?
It'd be like the anxiety and the
Yeah.
shaking.
Exactly, right? So this thing that never used to cause any fear, anxiety, any reaction at all, right? You get in and out of cars all the time. You don't even think about it, right? It doesn't do anything to my body, right? But after this pairing, what ends up happening is anytime I get in the car, I'm having an automatic physiological response because my body has paired the car, which was a neutral stimulus, with the accident and the injury, which was the unconditioned stimulus. It's paired those two, and now the car by itself is now triggering reactions associated with anxiety, fear, danger, threat, and things like that. Okay. People kind of see how that fits together. Okay, how about this? Let's do an example that's a little less friggin' grim. All right. Let's say, think about this. All right, I want you to sort of think in your head. Your first person you ever dated, the first crush you ever had, like sort of this person who you're just like super, super, super into. Okay. And let's say so you were in this relationship for a while, and this person had like a distinctive cologne or perfume, something. They had smell. The smell was just really fantastic, right? And anytime you were around this person, they had this perfume, this sort of thing, sort of like a Fine Axe body spray or something like that, that sort of really sort of started to get you sort of triggering things inside your body, right? So you've got this sort of activation, arousal that's associated with this smell, okay? But things go wrong, as they often do, with first loves. And so this relationship goes south, and you sort of break up. You haven't seen this person for ever and ever. Okay. But at some point down the road, you walk past someone and you smell their perfume, and it's the same perfume that sort of was associated with this first person that you sort of fell in love with, dated, something along those lines. And what's the reaction? Or what could be the reaction?
You might think it's her.
Okay, Jonathan, you might think it's her. What's going on in your body? What's that? Oh, can you type in the chat, Jonathan? Your mic's just. Okay, pause or tense up. Okay, sorry, was having a hard time hearing you. Pause, tense up, maybe, or some of those same feelings. Sort of some of that arousal, some of that natural sort of reaction comes back, right? You're like, oh wow, I'm sort of sort of feeling a little sort of worked up about something, right? Okay. In this situation, doesn't involve fear or any sort of horrible, terrible injury to people, but in this situation, someone help me out. What in this situation is the conditioned stimulus in this situation?
The perfume.
The perfume. Perfect. Okay. And what's the conditioned response?
Arousal or certain feelings.
Yeah. So the emotions, the arousal, the feelings. So we've got this perfume that's triggered sort of this reflexive, sort of physical and emotional response. Okay. So what is sort of before, when you first started dating this person, what's the neutral stimulus then?
The perfume again.
The perfume, right? Perfect. Before you were dating this person, that perfume didn't do anything to you. You might have noticed it. You're like, oh, that's a thing. I like it or I don't like it, what have you, right? But it didn't mean anything. But when we pair it, and so what is the unconditioned stimulus in this scenario? What's the thing that's causing a reaction that you didn't need to know or learn? It was just there. Okay.
Is it the feeling of arousal again?
Okay, yeah. Who said the person? Someone did. Okay, cool. Kylie, yeah, you're exactly right. The person. So this person that I was super, super attracted to, that I was super into, that's the unconditioned stimulus. And the unconditioned response is my feelings of sort of emotion, arousal, sort of physiologically getting worked up when I'm around this person. I get all sort of Twitter-pated and I can't even handle myself just because my body's going nuts anytime I'm around this person, right? I didn't have to learn that. That was just something that happened, right? So I've got an unconditioned stimulus, which is the person. The unconditioned response is sort of me feeling all sort of worked up, right? But then we throw this perfume in the mix. The perfume has no meaning. But when I pair the perfume with the person over and over and over again, we're going on dates, we're hanging out, we're sort of doing whatever we're doing, right? And then pretty soon, in the absence of that person, all I need to do is smell that perfume and sort of my body's reacting in the same way through a classical conditioning paradigm. Okay. Do people see kind of how this is sort of working out? So what we've done is we've conditioned a biologically reflexive reaction when it shouldn't occur because some unconditioned stimulus has been paired with some neutral type of thing. So going back to this phantom phone vibration, right? Let's say I'm not sure about sort of feeling things that they're not there. I'm not too certain about that. But let's say that, let's take it back to the dating situation. Let's say I'm dating somebody and so this is my new person. I'm super jazzed about this person. And I put my phone I give them a certain sort of ring or vibration or something like that, right? And so we're sort of they're getting in touch. And every time I hear that ring vibration, I get super excited because I know it's them, and I'm sort of texting or sort of doing whatever you guys sort of do. I'm not sure what the preferred social media platform is these days for sort of getting back in touch with one another. But let's say then, okay, so this is hot and heavy sort of going on, but then that crashes and burns, as things will happen. And so then later on, right, now you hear this same ring, sort of vibration, something like that happens, and all of a sudden sort of that excitement comes back. That, again, would be a classical conditioning response there. Okay. People feel like they got a decent handle on sort of the elements of classical conditioning. This is important, because you know what I'm going to do. I'm going to be like, here's sort of Jacob has done X, Y, and Z. So which is this and then that. So you want to make sure that you go through and you've got these elements pulled together and can identify that stuff. Okay. All right. Some things that, some principles in classical conditioning we need to be aware of. Acquisition. This is the initial learning of that stimulus response, right? This stage 2 here, this is that acquisition phase. And what's interesting about acquisition is it's important that whatever that neutral stimulus is, it has to be presented immediately before or right during the unconditioned stimulus in order for this to work. Okay? Why does this make sense? Why can't I ring the bell after the dog's already eating the food? Why is that not going to help me develop a conditioned response?
Its biological response has already happened.
Yeah, exactly. That bell no longer, yeah, exactly. Colin, Jonathan, both correct. The dog's already gotten the food. The bell's just something that's going on in the background. I'm not even paying attention to that, right? If we think about why, and again, this is the same thing. It doesn't matter if you're a human being or a sea slug, same principles, right? Because again, this is an adaptive process. This is very, very useful, right? This classical conditioning allows us animals, sort of the whole gamut, to start to anticipate biologically important things, okay? That way I don't have to think about things over and over and over again so I starve to death or get killed. My body sort of makes this connection so that I don't have to go through and think through it, right? But if I have something after, someone yells, look out, 5 minutes into the attack by the bear, that's not helping me out anything because the thing's already happened, right? So we need to have this neutral stimulus be presented immediately before or concurrently with the unconditioned stimulus during acquisition in order for classical conditioning to occur, okay? And then we can start playing around with the parameters. We can get some other types of things. So we see something called higher order conditioning, okay? Higher order conditioning involves the acquisition of a conditioned response in the presence of an additional neutral stimulus, okay? You ready for this? This is mind blown, all right? Once I've already acquired a conditioned response, if I go through and I layer on a new neutral stimulus, every time you're having that conditioned response, what we can do is we can start to see that second neutral stimulus also start to elicit a neutral response, okay? So let's say I am out and about and I am assaulted violently by a man with terrible, terrible coffee breath, okay? Like let's say that this is a situation. Like I get beaten severely by someone with sort of very horrible coffee breath, right? And I sort of remember this, okay? And so if there's a classically conditioned response, what's likely to happen every time I smell coffee breath?
You might get anxious.
I might get anxious.
If there's danger.
Yeah, perfect, Colin. So what we've done is we've got coffee breath, which is a neutral stimulus, was paired with a violent beating, which is an unconditioned stimulus. The violent beating produced fear and anxiety, but now, because it was very intense, coffee breath now elicits fear and anxiety. Okay, this is just our classical conditioning stimulus situation. No worries here, okay? But let's say I work in my office with someone who has violent coffee breath, and every time they talk to me, I start to get nervous and anxious, okay? But let's say this person also has some other distinctive feature. Let's say it's a mustache, right? This person's got a distinctive mustache. Higher order conditioning would say if mustache guy comes in and talks with me with coffee breath enough, and every time he's talking to me with coffee breath, I get fear and anxious, right? But also, every time I'm getting fearful and anxious because I'm smelling coffee breath, this mustache is always in the way, right? What would higher order, if we're working on principles of higher order conditioning, eventually, what's going to happen when I see a mustache?
You'll also feel like you're in need.
I'm also going to feel fear and anxiety, right? The mustache had nothing to do with the initial pairing, but every single time I'm now paired with the mustache with coffee breath, I'm sort of getting anxious. What can happen is that the mustache now elicits the same, and it's usually much weaker, but can elicit a reaction as an unconditioned response or a conditioned response, sort of based on a pairing with a previous thing. And so we start to see this sort of getting paired up and paired up and paired up like this. Okay, so people see kind of what's going on with this higher order conditioning example. Basically, we take and it usually has to be a pretty strong classical conditioning response. But once that's paired, if I then layer in a new neutral stimulus that's present every time I present the conditioned stimulus, which is resulting in a conditioned response, pretty soon that new neutral stimulus can develop its own, sort of be a higher order conditioning. Through higher order conditioning process, it can then sometimes start to elicit things going on there. Okay. Questions about that? All right. We also see generalization. Okay. Generalization is the presence of a conditioned response in the presence of some stimuli similar to the conditioned stimulus. Okay. Here, let's say that, what do I have for an example here? Okay. All right. So going back to the arousal example. Okay. Let's say I have a sort of a partner who has an odor, they have a perfume, something like that, that really sort of gets me going, right? And pretty soon, all I need to do is smell that to start sort of having some of these feelings. What generalization would say is maybe now what happens is I start to respond to other things that aren't the same perfume, but other perfumes that sort of maybe just perfumes in general. Maybe this person really got to me. And now anytime someone has a strong scent or something like that, it starts to make me feel all funny inside. That would be an example of generalization. Okay. So what we're seeing is people responding to having a conditioned response to things that aren't the specific stimuli that was initially there, but similar stimuli. I also start to react to that type of thing. Okay. And this is where when we're thinking about phobias and sort of different anxiety processes, I might have had a conditioned stimuli or conditioned fear response to one thing, but now what happens is I'm starting to react similarly to, so let's say I grow up in Wyoming and have sort of a bad accident with a horse or something along those lines. I'm a little kid, right? And what we see is anytime I see a horse, I have a meltdown, sort of intense fear, things like that, even if you show me pictures of horses. But maybe what happens is generalization. Maybe I start to respond to cows or deer or other things that aren't horses, but they're sort of things that look like horses. This would be an example of generalization. Okay. And then finally, discrimination. Okay, this is our capacity to distinguish between our conditioned stimuli and things that aren't the same. Okay, so maybe what I do in the sort of the partner situation is they have a scent or a smell or a perfume that sort of will activate sort of a reaction to me, but I don't react to other things, right? So like I get a similar stimulus or a similar scent, and I don't react to that, even though it might be similar. This is would be an example of discrimination. Okay, so maybe in Colin's car accident example, right? Maybe Colin, you were driving a Mazda Miata, and that's what you got in your. Colin drives a Miata. Everybody, so I
I
don't.
actually drove a Mazda 3 and I actually did get hit by a car once. And every time a car comes to turn out of a driveway, I like flinch.
Okay, well now I can't laugh about my example that I sort of made you drive a Miata. You kind of it's like kind of a downer. Thanks. Right? No, but that's it exactly. That's a good that's a good example, right? But let's say then, so it's a Mazda 3. Okay, so let's say anytime you get in a Mazda 3 or something that looks similar to that, you start to have a pretty intense reaction. But if you're in a sedan or a sort of an old boat or a truck or something along those lines, you don't have that same reaction. That would be an example of discrimination where it's very specific to this thing, but other similar sort of things or vehicles don't create the same type of response. All right, people comfortable with some of this stuff? All right. So, other thing that's important to think about is extinction. How do we get rid of this stuff? Is this stuff permanent? That's the big question.
About discrimination.
Yeah.
So is that like why those aversion studies about like addiction don't always work because they can just discriminate between where they get their drinks or where they get stuff?
Yeah, that's one of the difficulties with some of sort of efforts to, and we'll sort of get into this next, extinguish some of these learned responses. It starts to happen, and so this works when we're working with people who are experiencing anxiety related to some sort of trauma or something along those lines, right? Like I can go through and have you do exposure exercises where I'm having you work through sort of situations that make you fearful, and we can get you really good at those exercises, but we're still not seeing a generalization to other things that are sort of going on in your life. And so this is why when we're working with these principles in treatment, why it's important to get people exposure to a broad range of things, right? So let's say I'm working with someone who has social anxiety, and so to trigger that social anxiety and to sort of help them move through, I have a Confederate come in during sessions and talk with this person. You have to have a conversation with someone that I brought into the session, right? And you might get really good at having a conversation with that person, but as soon as we get out of the therapy room and have you go try and talk to sort of maybe someone in the union, it doesn't generalize because there's a discrimination piece to that too. So yeah, Colin, that's a sort of a good sort of catch on that stuff. But when we're talking about this extinction, right? And we're talking about extinction, we're talking about the reduction of a conditioned response in the absence of an unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so if no one wants to I'll stop harassing people, I guess. It makes no one want to have their camera on. But I'll pick on Daniel. Daniel, let's say I'm Pavlov, okay, and I have this bell. And I go through and I ring this bell, and I ring this bell, and I ring this bell, and I ring this bell. Dog salivating, salivating, salivating. But if I just continue to ring that bell and never bring food back, what's eventually going to happen?
They're probably going to stop salivating because they're not getting food.
Yeah. Eventually they're going to stop salivating. And this is a process of extinction. And this makes sense from a biological standpoint. If I'm getting a signal, but the anticipated outcome never occurs again, it doesn't make sense for my body to hold on to that, right? So I'm going to stop responding. We'll call this extinction, okay? So again, what we see is a reduction in that conditioned response in the absence of that unconditioned stimulus. And so if we're talking about exposure-based therapies, right, this is the whole idea. Colin, you were in an accident, and so what I would have you do is sit in the car and drive cars and sort of go through and just spend a lot of time in those cars, and hopefully when you're doing that, you're not getting in an accident, you're not put in danger and things along those lines, right? And so through that process, if I'm exposed to it enough, that reaction is going to come down, right? But the interesting thing we see is it looks like they don't go away forever. They're not completely gone. They're not erased from my memory. Some things that we see in research is something called spontaneous recovery. This is the return of a conditioned response following extinction. Okay, so maybe if we're talking about Pavlov, right? And Dan, you go through and you ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell. Pretty soon this dog's not salivating, never salivates to the bell. And so we say, okay, we've extinguished that response, and we have. But like maybe 3 weeks down the road, you happen to sort of someone rings a bell, all of a sudden the dog starts salivating again. This would be spontaneous recovery. Okay. And this is a tricky thing in treatment. We can go through and get people's anxiety down to feared situations, but sometimes, seemingly for no reason at all, boom, that conditioned response will just come back, suggesting that it didn't go away. We didn't scrub it. It's not gone. It's still there. It's just hiding under the surface somewhere. Okay. We also see something called reinstatement. Reinstatement is the return of an extinguished conditioned response following the subsequent presentation of an unconditioned stimulus. Okay. So let's say, going back to Pavlov, let's say ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell. Dog's not salivating. But one time, someone comes in with food for the dog and someone rings a bell or something like that. Now all of a sudden we're back. Every time I ring that bell, the dog's salivating again. Okay. What's interesting here is that it might have taken 40 times to go through and get that initial initial conditioned response going. But we've gone through and extinguished it. It's not happening. But now, even following one pairing, we're back at full bore. We're back, and every time I ring the bell, now that dog's salivating. Again, suggests that we didn't scrub that extinction, didn't scrub that away, right? Because if it scrubbed it away, how many times would we expect to have to pair the bell and the food again before we get back that full conditioned response? 30, 40 times, right? With reinstatement, we see even one additional pairing, we're back into the mix. Okay. Last thing we see is renewal. Okay, renewal involves the return of an extinguished conditioned response in the presence of the initial learning environment. Okay, so let's say Dan's working again on Pavlov's study. Go through, all right, we're done with the dogs. We take the dogs out. We ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell, ring the bell. Dog's not salivating to food or salivating the bell ever, right? And we take it out, take the dog home. Dog's our pet now. Going through, ringing bells, doesn't happen anything along those lines. But now what happens is we take the dog back to, say, the lab where that initial pairing took place, and now we pull it out, and now all of a sudden, anytime that dog, we ring that bell, we see salivation again in that dog. Okay, that would be a situation of renewal. We see a return of that extinguished conditioned response once we've gone back into the new environment. Okay, so let's say Colin's got driving anxiety. We're treating him. We're going through. He's feeling pretty good now. He's able to drive, no problem, no reaction. But then maybe Colin drives back through his accident site. Boom, we're back to where we were before. Every time I get in the car, I'm fearful, I'm shaking, I'm sweating. This would be an example of renewal. Okay, and so because of this, what we know is that extinction, at one point we think about, extinction just kind of erases this pairing. This pairing is no longer there. It's gone. We've scrubbed it from your brain. It no longer exists, right? But what we see with spontaneous recovery, reinstatement, renewal, that it looks like that pairing is still there. It's just kind of hanging out somewhere. And so what we think now in terms of the processes with extinction is why extinction works, is what we're doing is we're not erasing that old learning. You're not forgetting it. What we're doing is we're just layering new learning on top of it. Okay. So Dan, when you're going through and you're ringing the bell, ringing the bell, ringing the bell, ringing the bell, right? And eventually that dog stops salivating to the bell. It's not that dog forgot that at one point in time there was a connection there. It's just learned now on top of it that bell doesn't mean anything, right? I've got new learning that I've layered onto that initial conditioning so that I know now I don't have to salivate because that bell doesn't mean anything. I've learned that the bell doesn't mean anything, right? But that initial learning is still there, and it can pop back up if we have an additional pairing, or we're back in the original thing, or sometimes it just pops up for no reason at all. So a very interesting sort of way of understanding sort of why we can still get some of this stuff even when we've reliably extinguished a conditioned response. And sort of one of the things that starts to get tricky in terms of treatment is even if we get someone down, they're feeling pretty good, it's possible sometimes that this stuff can kind of pop back in. Okay. All right, we'll talk about Little Albert. We'll finish with Little Albert on Monday. Again, this is really cool stuff. Kind of hard to get your head wrapped around, but once you kind of have a handle of on the symptom or on the system, things work out pretty good, and so you can start to sort of figure out pieces and parts and stuff. Okay. questions. And again, if you need to split, do that. I don't want to sort of hold you here. We'll have this all recorded, so we'll pick it up later. But any questions on sort of any of the principles of conditioning that we've gone through here? Okay, cool. Well, what I would say as you're going through trying to get a handle on this is something that people, I can tell you, it's hard to, people have a hard time wrapping your head around. What I would do is as you're going through trying to work through these principles, go through and come up with examples on your own, or look at examples on the internet to try and get sort of different examples to kind of put these things into place till it starts to click. And then once it clicks, then it's boom, it's easy to go through and sort of recognize, okay, this is how things work together. So work through examples, focus on the application here. If you run into questions or get examples you're not sure are good examples, just shoot me an email, let me know. I'll sort of get you on the right track with that. Okay. All right, folks. Have a great weekend. Thanks for hanging in there with me. Again, nice work on quiz 3. Yep, and we'll catch you on Monday. All right, we'll see you, folks.